Thank you very much, and really want to thank the organizers. I'm having a great time. Hope you're not falling asleep. I'll try to show you some cute baby videos to keep you awake. Okay, we've heard so far today a lot of questions and talk about development and children and what they can do and how they learn and all these questions, and I'm going to try to just tell you a few things. In the time frame, I can't tell you about all of the studies, but give you a little bit of a feel for what children can do and what they learn and how they learn and why music is important in development. So this is just an outline. I'm going to just give you an idea of some of the early abilities that infants have, and in particular I'll look at preferences for consonants and sensitivity to timbre. And then I'm going to talk about enculturation. So when we think about language, we know that we have a lot of research on how children learn language, but children have to learn their musical system just the way they have to learn the particular language of the culture that they grow up in. And so we've been studying that process, and I'll tell you a little bit about that. And then in the second half, I want to talk about why music is so powerful. And I'm going to look at rhythm entrainment and in the context of social development now, and this will actually, it was great that Annie Patel and others talked earlier today about the social context of music. And I'll show you how just how important that is really early in development. Okay, so as it turns out, infants are not just passive creatures that sit there and don't have much going on inside their head. From a very young age, they actually show some musical preferences. And in particular, they show a preference for consonants over dissonance. This is a 6-month-old that I'll show you here, but we've tested this as young as 2 months of age. This also illustrates the kind of methodologies that we have to use if we want to answer questions about what young infants can perceive, because obviously we can't ask them. Well, we can, but they won't respond, right? So this is what we call a preferential looking paradigm, and what you'll see is we'll flash a light on this side, and when the infant looks, we'll play, in this case it's a little Mozart piece, and the infant controls how long they listen, because when they turn away, the music will go off. There's a similar setup to this on the other side, and we'll play a dissonant version of that same piece. Again, as long as the infant looks, it will stay on, and when the infant looks away, it will go off. So the infant here is controlling how long they listen to the different kinds of music that we present. So lights flashing, the infant looks. So the experimenter centers the infant here, and then the light starts flashing on this side. Of course, the experimenter and the parent wear headphones, so they can't hear what the infant's hearing. So they don't know they're not aware of what the infant is listening to. Okay. So when we do this, and we've done it with different stimuli, as I said, as young as 2 months and probably younger, we just haven't tested younger, infants have a preference for consonants over dissonance. So we believe that this actually arises very early in the peripheral auditory system, just based on the way the cochlea works, and that it probably forms the basis of all musical pitch in some form or other, whether using atonal music, which is a reaction against it, or whether using tonal music and looking around the world as well. So that's just to show you that some preferences seem to be either innate or develop very early. But at the same time, infants are learning from what they're hearing in the environment from a very early age. And this, again, is just an example study to show you this. This particular study is on timbre or sound quality. And what we had infants do in this case was we sent them a CD that either had, these were synthesized timbres, one was called guitar and one was called marimba. And they listened to the CD for 20 minutes a day, so they'd hear pieces like this. Oops. Or they would hear the same piece, but in a different timbre. And then in this case, we used EEG to measure their brain responses. And what we were interested in was whether listening, this little bit of listening experience to one timbre or another timbre, if that would actually change the brain's responses to tones in those timbres. So we tested with tones that the infants had, with pitches that the infants had actually never heard, and we would play one pitch over and over again, occasionally change to a different pitch, and then we would measure their EEG responses to those tones. Most of you are familiar with EEG. I probably don't have to go into too many details. But basically, if you present a sound at this time, you can track over time by measuring at the electrical activity at the surface of the head. You can measure a series of positive and negative deflections over time that represent the brain's processing of that sound over the next half a second to a second or whatever. And so that's what we do. And when you do that, in the interest of time, I won't go through all the details, but you get a tracing in the infants. And this particular trace here shows guitar exposed group, so the group that heard guitar tones at home. And you can see they're showing larger responses to the guitar tones than they are to the marimba tones. And that's just shown graphically down here. So the take-home message from this study is that a rather short amount of experience at 4 months of age with one timbre or another is actually tuning up the brain to be more responsive to that timbre. So learning is happening right from the beginning, and in some cases it happens very quickly. This also tells us that when you're playing music for babies, the sound quality matters because their brain is getting tuned up for whatever you are playing them or whatever they're hearing in the environment. So they may have some innate preferences, but learning is having a really profound effect. Okay, so they may have some early innate preferences or abilities, but we all know that different systems around the world use different scales, they use different rhythmic patterns, and so on. And so one of the things that infants learn is the particular structure of the music that they're exposed to, and we call this enculturation. It happens without any formal training, just the way infants learn the language of their culture without any formal training. And I'll just give you a couple of examples of enculturation. So in terms of rhythms, in Western music, we tend to use very simple meters. We usually divide things into groups of 2, occasionally into groups of 3. But in fact, many systems around the world use complex meters. So they'll use groups of 7 or groups of 11. And so what Aaron Hannon did, this is work of Sandra Trieb and Aaron Hannon, is they familiarized either adults or infants with something that was either in 4/4 time, which is very Western, or something that was in 7/4 time, which is, say, from Bulgaria, or this particular piece was from Bulgaria. And then they made changes in those rhythms, and they looked at people's ability to detect changes in those rhythms. In infants, they did a preferential listening test of the type that I showed you before. And what they found was, and these are all Western infants and adults, Western infants were able to detect changes in both the simple and the complex meters, so they didn't perform better on the simple meters. North American adults performed well only on the simple meters. They did not perform well on the complex meters. And 12-month-old Western infants were already like adults in performing better on the simple meters than the complex meters. So what this is telling us is that early on, it's as if infants are open to processing any kind of meters that you might find around the world, and that already by 12 months of age, which is pretty young, they're becoming specialized for the particular rhythms of their culture. So I think this has implications, certainly in terms of education and how we teach rhythm. We tend to think here in the West that we should teach simple rhythms first and complex rhythms only much later, but perhaps we should be teaching complex rhythms early on. There was talk earlier in the day about language and relations between music and language and reading, and that I don't have time to go into, but if anyone wants to talk to me about that after, there's a whole story there as well. Okay, so music also has a pitch structure in addition to a rhythmic structure, and infants have to learn the particular pitch structure of the culture in which they find themselves. So the question is, how young can they do that? And in this particular study, we looked at whether intensive musical experiences would accelerate that process. So in this particular study, we looked at infants who were actually 6 months of age at the beginning of the study, and they had 6 months of special training, musical training in groups, and then we looked at them after the 6 months of training. This study, I should mention, we've also had a lot of talk today about correlational studies and whether you can infer causality and the use of random assignment and so on. And I should mention that this study used random assignment. So we had children come into Ontario early years centers, which are drop-in centers for preschool children and their parents in Ontario. And we randomly assigned them to one of two groups. So one group came in every week and had a Suzuki early childhood music class, and the other group came in and they also had a class every week. But God help me, we played them Baby Einstein CDs in the background because those are actually marketed to make your baby smarter. And are you all familiar with the Baby Einstein CDs? Yeah. So there's synthesized music, there's no interactive music making. And then in the passive class, the kids just played at book station, ball station, and so on. And the parents enjoyed it. We gave them CDs to take home and play at home, and they seemed to like that. So before and after the 6 months of training, we measured a bunch of different things in the infants. And in particular, as I said, we were interested in whether this kind of training might enhance their enculturation to Western music. So we did a test using our preferential looking, like I showed you for the consonance and dissonance study, but we used two different pieces here. And in particular, what we used was, this is a piece by Thomas Atwood that's not very familiar. Yeah, so it goes on like that. It follows all the rules of Western tonality and so on. And then we changed it so that it changes key. It goes up and down a semitone every beat. So it sounds like this. Okay. And so the idea here is that we didn't introduce any dissonance into this, because if there's a major chord in version A, there's a major chord in version B, etc. But there's no longer a tonal center. Okay? So everything else is the same, except there's no longer a tonal center. In adults, of course, they show a strong preference for the tonal version. In infants, without any musical training, as old as 12 months, they don't show a preference for one version over the other. They're equally happy to listen to either version. And so we were curious what would happen with our infants in these two training groups. And what we found was that the ones in the Suzuki group did show a preference for the tonal version over the atonal version, but the ones who were listening to the Baby Einstein CDs didn't show any preference still. Okay? So what this tells us is that with an interactive music class involving the parents as participants and singing, a lot of singing and little musical instruments, drums and xylophones and so on, that already by year of age you can show training effects in infants. And this actually ties into what Isabel Peretz was saying, because we also measured in these kids not just their enculturation to Western tonality, but we measured early language ability and also their social development, because we wondered whether this kind of musical training might affect those variables as well. And so we measured at time 1, which was when they started at 6 months of age, and when they finished at 12 months of age, time 2. We used the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Developmental Index to measure early language development. So this is mostly just how many gestures they will do. Will they eat with a fork? Will they hug a doll? That sort of thing. At time 1, they make very few gestures because they're just 6 months. But at time 2, the children in the active music classes were making more gestures than the kids in the passive music class. So development of pre-linguistic communication gestures was more advanced with active compared to passive music training. And then we also performed the infant behavior checklist, a standardized measure of social emotional development. And there are 4 subtests that we looked at. And in all of them, the kids in the active Suzuki class showed better social functioning than the kids in the other class. So this first the first dimension was distress to limitation. So this is when, how does the infant react to crying and fussing when things go wrong? And the Suzuki trained, the active trained children showed less distress. How much distress to approach a novel stimulus? Again, the Suzuki kids showed less distress at time 2. The Suzuki kids showed more smiling and laughter at time 2. And they were more easily soothed at time 2. So what this suggests is that these early music classes involving active participation of mothers and infants ended up with more positive social emotional development in the infants. And so I think this is really an important finding, because it suggests that really early on, these musical interactions that are naturally going on between parents and infants, if you can enhance those, you can actually affect social development. I'm going to skip this in the interest of time. And then I should also mention that we measured brain responses in these infants, and there were no differences at 6 months of age, but at 12 months of age, in the red, you can see that the kids in the active music classes showed earlier and larger brain responses to sound, musical sounds, than the kids in the passive classes. Again, suggesting that this early training, we can actually see the effects on the brain itself. Okay, so just to sort of summarize the first part here, infants are musically amazing. There are some universal aspects of music that are seen very early in development, such as a preference for consonants, but infants' brains are becoming specialized for what they are hearing, so whether it's timbres or the music classes that they're in. So what they're hearing and what they're exposed to is very important. And by the end of the first year after birth, infants are becoming specialized for the rhythms and the tonal structures of the music that they hear. So really, all of this development is happening at quite an early age. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the second part of my talk, which is really on rhythm and social development. And I think it follows nicely from some of the talks that you heard earlier today. So I don't have to go into this. Music and movement are intimately connected. We've heard about this already today. In terms of the neural circuits that you need to perform a rhythmic movement, they're very primitive. So a jellyfish, which arguably doesn't even have a brain, it has a few neurons, it can perform rather sophisticated, beautiful rhythmic movement. Okay? The trick is when you try to integrate that with auditory rhythms, and when you want to be flexible to be able to go at different tempos, faster and slower, that's when things become complicated. But the actual circuit is well understood to produce a rhythmic movement. I don't have to go through this either because Annie Patel talked about this morning. His very nice study and the study by Schachner show that very few species actually can entrain to an auditory beat. Okay? So what we were interested in was two things. First of all, how early does this show up in infancy? If this is something that's really fundamental, we should be able to see it really early in development. And second of all, is this a one-way phenomenon or is it two-way? So the studies that Annie was talking about showed that when you listen to an auditory rhythm, it affects your movement. So parts of the brain light up that have to do with rhythmic movement. In Parkinson's patients, it can help them to move. But is it a bidirectional? So does the way you move actually affect how you hear or how you interpret a pattern? Okay? And so in order to do this, we took the fact that you can have what's called an ambiguous rhythm pattern. So in this case, if you take a rhythm pattern that's 6 beats long, you can divide it into 2 groups of 3, or you can divide it into 3 groups of 2, as in I Like to Be in America, which switches every bar between the 2 interpretations. If you present it, okay, so we used a rhythm that was much simpler. This is what it sounds like with accents every 3rd beat. Can you hear that that's in 3 groups of 3? And now if we take the same rhythm, but we accent every 2nd beat, okay, so those sound really different, right? But they're actually the same rhythm. It's just how you accent it that is different. If you play it without accents, adults will interpret it one way or the other. They'll hear it as 2 groups of 3, or they'll hear it as 3 groups of 2. And so what we did with adults is we played them this ambiguous rhythm with no accents. They held the hands of the experimenter, and the experimenter, for half of them, they bounced up and down on every 2nd beat, and for half they bounced up and down on every 3rd beat. So we wanted to know, would that disambiguate it? Would that make them hear it in groups of 2 or make them hear it in groups of 3, depending on how they were moved? Okay? And indeed it does. So if they were bounced on every 2nd beat, they were much more likely to tell us afterwards that they heard it sounded like a rhythm in groups of 2. And if they were bounced on every 3rd beat, they told us that they heard a rhythm that was in groups of 3. So in other words, how you move to a rhythm affects how you interpret that rhythm. Works if you're blindfold, so you don't need visual cues, but it helps to move. If you just watch somebody else moving, you don't get the same effect. So it's important that you actually move yourself in order for this to occur. So how early does this develop? Well, the answer is very early. We did a study with infants where we bounced them, so we played them the same ambiguous rhythm, so with no accent, same 6-beat rhythm, and half of the infants we bounced on every 3rd beat. And you can also see the importance of rhythm in how much infants love this, right? We usually have a few that cry or fuss and don't want to complete our study, but in this case, everyone completed the study. The other half of the infants were bounced on every 2nd beat. And then afterwards, we gave them a preference test. So the same test, the same methodology I mentioned before. And so on one side, they had now accents. They heard the rhythm with accents on every 3rd beat. And on the other side, they heard the rhythm with accents on every 2nd beat. And what we found was if they had been bounced on every 2nd beat, they preferred to listen to the rhythm with accents every 2nd beat. If they were bounced on every 3rd beat, they preferred to listen to the rhythm with accents every 3rd beat. So with infants as well, the way that they're moving is affecting how they're hearing things. So we can't just think about music as being an auditory phenomenon. It really involves how you move and the whole motor system as well. Again, in infants, you can blindfold them, it still works, although they're not quite as happy. And, but if they just watch somebody else moving, you don't get the effect. So they have to actually be moved in order to see the effect. We've been doing a bunch of studies in adults looking at the neural mechanisms of this. I'm not going to talk very much about this at all. But a number of people have mentioned this morning about we don't really understand the neural mechanisms yet of how the auditory system and the motor system couple. And we've been using EEG to look at oscillatory activity in the brain. And we're finding that particularly in the beta band, which is about 15 to 25 cycles per second, when we present a rhythm, a regular rhythm, that can be fast, or in this case it can be much slower, we get oscillations in the power and the beta band activity that follow the tempo of the rhythm. So this oscillatory activity seems to be encoding the rhythm. And furthermore, this is an MEG study, and again, you can ask me afterwards if you want more details. But with MEG, we can do a sort of voxel by voxel analysis across the brain, and just presenting the auditory rhythm, we're finding this beta band oscillation in the supplementary motor area, the cerebellum, so some regions of the motor system that are in sync with the auditory system in these oscillations in the beta band. So we think that we may be getting at the mechanism here which couples the auditory and the motor regions. Okay, so I'm just going to end with telling you about a recent study that we're still working on, but it has to do with social interaction because, like Isabel Peretz, I'm becoming more convinced that the real power of music is less in its cognitive benefits and more in its sort of social, emotional effects. And also, as was mentioned earlier today, there are a couple of studies, 3 studies I think now in adults, showing that when people move in synchrony with each other, they're more likely to cooperate with each other. And then Annie showed this morning the study in those 5-year-old kids, I think, 4 or 5-year-old kids, Kirshner's study, showing that kids of that age seem to also cooperate more if they've experienced motor entrainment to a rhythm. So we wanted to see how young this might occur. And so the youngest age that we have looked at so far is 14 months. We're now actually doing an infant study, but in the 14-month-olds, what we did was we bounced them in one of 2 conditions. So each infant was randomly assigned to one of 2 conditions. In one condition, they were bounced in synchrony with an experimenter. And in the other condition, they were bounced out of synchrony with an experimenter. And then we tested their helping behavior. So here's just an example of how it works. So there's 2 experimenters here. This experimenter is really just a bouncer, and that's all. And so she has strong legs now from this study because 14-month-olds are not light. So this is my graduate student, Kate Einerson. And so she bounced the infant up and down according to what she heard over her headphones. And then the real experimenter, Laura Sorelli, whose study this is part of her PhD thesis, she also wore headphones and bounced according to what she heard over the headphones. And Laura and the infant were looking at each other. So this is where the synchrony is that we're interested in. So this is just when they're bouncing in synchrony. When they're bouncing in synchrony. Yeah. So the infants got either 2 minutes of bouncing in synchrony or 2 minutes of bouncing not in synchrony. And then this is what some of the helping tests look like. This is an example of an infant who helped.
Trying a picture. 4, 5. Oops. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Uh-oh. Okay. Clothespin. Ready? Oops. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Uh-oh.
the social referencing. He looks at her, and then he looks at the object, looks at her, looks at the object.
Okay.
Okay. And equally cute is this one of an infant who doesn't help.
3. Oopsie. Oh no. Uh-oh. Oh no. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Oh no.
And, you know, she has 2 other clothespins in her hand from previous trials, so she didn't want to give up those clothespins. So normally in these cases, infants will help. On about 50% of trials across a group of infants, they'll help. And what we found was that the infants who were bounced synchronously helped 60% of the time. Those who were bounced asynchronously helped only 27% of the time. So it seems that even as young as 14 months, infants who move synchronously with an experimenter are more likely to help that experimenter. And if you think about, you know, a mother-infant interaction, there's a lot of synchrony there. You know, the mother is moving the infant at the same time that she's talking to the infant and so on. And those interactions are probably really important for social development. So synchronizing rhythmically with others is important for social development, we think. Of course, this is just our first study. We have a lot of other variables that we're looking at. So we need to make sure that the helping is only towards the person that they were synchronized with. We're interested in whether the music itself has to be there or whether just moving together is enough to do it, and so on. But there's a lot of questions, but I think it's a really interesting first finding. And also, I'm just going to mention briefly, too, we're going to be looking at this whole idea in our new facility that we're going to have at McMaster University, which is just pictured here. It's going to be a 100-seat auditorium, so concert hall, but it's going to be equipped with all kinds of equipment that we can measure all kinds of things, including physiological responses from audience members and EEG from multiple musicians playing at the same time. Have variable acoustics so we can change how the sounds sound and so on. So we're really interested in these synchronized, this idea of synchrony. How do musicians play together? How do audiences respond and so on? And if anyone is interested, the facility we hope will be up and running by January, February. And if anyone is interested in experiments in the facility or whatever, we'd like to make it as open as possible. We're also doing our annual conference this year is on music and dance. So if you're interested in that, you can also ask me for information. So I thought I'll just end with a little video clip of one of the infants who was in the Suzuki music training study. I just wanted to do this to illustrate you what's possible for really young infants to do. This particular in the classes, the mothers often held their hands while they played on the xylophone, and the infants had never played the xylophone by themselves. And for those of you who are, know about pediatrics, infants at 12 months are not terribly coordinated. But this was sort of typical. So after we just gave them the mallets, looked at what they were going to do with them. Kids in the control group who didn't have this experience mostly ate the mallets or sort of flung them around. But this is what the kids did who had the music classes. So he's never been able to hold the mallets himself before.
Good job.
To me, this is
Good job
extremely
playing.
impressive for a 12-month-old. And he's even trying to do a little bit of the alternate
go.
mallet.
Elliot! Do you like the play? Elliot!
He crosses the mallets, and that's the indication that their turn is over. So he's learned that as well when they pass it around the circle. Okay, so just to summarize, infants' brains become specialized for what they are hearing, so what they hear is really important. Active participation appears to be a lot better than passive listening. By the end of the first year after birth, infants are becoming specialized for the rhythmic and tonal structures of the music that they hear. And finally, and maybe most important, synchronizing rhythmically with others seems to be really important for social development. Okay, thank you.
That was fantastic, Laura. I'm sure we have many questions, but we're going to only go till 4:15 because we have a 5 o'clock concert. So are there a couple quick questions, and then we'll let Dr. Heaton. Yes, please. Use the mic. Or... Here, go ahead.
I don't know how to do this. I'm a nurse at UNM, and I'm working on a public health course for the zip code that I live in. And my theme is like preventing violence. So I'm listening to you talk about babies who are being bounced and music and things like that. And I'm thinking, ooh, maybe we can, instead of starting in middle school to teach nonviolence and peer mediation and stuff, like, can we start much earlier and bounce these kids around and have them, play and play well with others?
Well, I have to tell you that we ran these, as I said, through the Ontario Early Years Centres. In Hamilton, I think there's about 12 of them. And they were so impressed with what they saw these kids doing and the reactions of the parents and so on, because some of these are in very low SES neighborhoods, that they have now trained people at every center to carry on the program. So they could see the benefits, not just in musical training, but that the parents were talking about the behaviors of their children and so on. So the study that we did initially was just up to age 12 months, but the study that we're going to be studying these kids as well, that they now have up to 3 years in the programs. But I think it's absolutely right. We sort of think music is a frill, and we don't understand what it's really doing at these very young ages. Yeah. Yeah. It used to be a prerequisite that kindergarten teachers had to play the piano and sing. It isn't anymore. So you can just put on a CD now in a kindergarten classroom, at least in Canada. I don't know about the States. Which, again, is something that we don't really think about, but I think we should, in light of some of these findings.
I have a question. What advice do you give to tone-deaf parents? Should they sing to their children?
Yeah, I don't know. I have to ask Isabel that. I think I haven't had any tone-deaf parents asking me that.
They should definitely sing to their children, and they do. They do, and their child around the age of 4 or 5 who is not affected will say, you really sing funny.
Thank you so much, Laurel. That was fantastic.